Late October 1979, the Kremlin, Moscow. The air in the gilded halls of power is thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and the cold, metallic tang of geopolitical tension. For the aged men of the Politburo, the world is a chessboard of stark, predictable calculations. Détente, the brief, flickering thaw in relations with the West, is dying. Soviet influence is on the march from Southeast Asia to Africa, and by late December 1979, their army would cross the border into Afghanistan to prop up a floundering communist regime. To the marshals of the Soviet General Staff and the analysts of the GRU, the balance of power, the great correlation of forces, has finally, definitively shifted in their favor. They saw nuclear parity with the United States. Their heavy SS-18 Satan missiles and vast MIRVed forces now matched America's land-based strength. Their fleets of Delta-class submarines prowled silently beneath the Arctic ice, a guaranteed second strike capability that ensured any American aggression would be met with total, annihilating retribution. Their certainty is grim, but it is absolute. They have studied the American psyche, their political system, their military doctrine. They believe they understand the enemy. In their minds, a nuclear war would begin in one of two ways: a massive, coordinated surprise attack by the Americans designed to decapitate the Soviet leadership, a bolt from the blue, or a catastrophic escalation from a conventional war in Europe. Every sensor, every spy, every satellite is geared to detect the telltale signs of such a move. They were listening for the surge in communications, watching for bomber dispersals, and above all, waiting for the infrared and radar cues of American missile launches. Their doctrine stressed massive retaliation and considered launch on warning. The moment they confirmed an American launch, their own apocalypse could be unleashed. It was the cold, hard logic of mutually assured destruction. In the autumn of 1979, the Soviet leadership felt they had a firm grasp on the rules of this terrifying game. They believed the trigger for World War III would be a conscious, deliberate decision, made in the Oval Office and transmitted to Strategic Air Command. They were confident in their ability to deter it, and if deterrence failed, to detect it and retaliate in kind. They had spent trillions of rubles and sacrificed the prosperity of their people to build this shield of certainty. They were wrong, completely, terrifyingly, and almost fatally wrong, because half a world away, the greatest threat to the Soviet Union, and indeed to all of humanity, was not a hawkish general in the Pentagon or a belligerent president in the White House. It wasn't a master plan for a first strike. The real threat was something the KGB could never infiltrate, something the GRU could never model in its war games. It was a ghost in the machine, a phantom signal born from a simple computer error buried nearly 2,000 feet inside a hollowed-out mountain in Colorado. The Soviet Union had prepared for a deliberate war of ideology and strategy. What they could never have comprehended was that the American nuclear war machine, the most complex and powerful system ever created, was about to be brought to the brink of launch not by an order, but by an error. This is the story of how a training tape and a faulty 46-cent computer chip nearly convinced the United States that a full-scale Soviet nuclear attack was underway, pushing the world closer to accidental annihilation than it had ever been or has been since. This is the story of the NORAD false alarms of 1979 and 1980. The silent crisis where the enemy wasn't in the Kremlin, but was already inside the command post. The story of the crisis begins, as all Cold War tales do, with the pursuit of absolute knowledge. By the 1970s, the United States had constructed a technological fortress of unimaginable scale and complexity. Its singular purpose, to detect a Soviet missile launch anywhere on the planet and provide the precious few minutes of warning the president would need to make the fateful decision to retaliate. The heart of this system was NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and its brain was buried deep inside Cheyenne Mountain. Hollowed out of solid granite, buried beneath some 2,000 feet of rock and protected by 25-ton steel blast doors, the Cheyenne Mountain Complex was a city designed to survive Armageddon. Its 15 separate buildings were not fixed to the rock, but mounted on over 1,300 massive steel springs, each weighing half a ton, engineered to absorb the shock of a direct hit. Into this nerve center, data poured from a global network of sensors. There were the giant, powerful radar arrays of the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, or BMEWS, in Alaska, Greenland, and England, staring relentlessly over the North Pole for the telltale arc of an intercontinental ballistic missile. There were spy satellites in geosynchronous orbit, part of the Defense Support Program, using infrared telescopes to spot the massive heat bloom of a rocket launch the second it cleared its silo. All of this information, radar tracks, infrared signatures, satellite telemetry, was fed into the NORAD computer system. Its job was to correlate the data, filter out false positives like solar flares or natural gas field fires, and present a clear, unambiguous picture of the threat to the duty officers sitting at their consoles. From there, an assessment would be passed in seconds to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon, to Strategic Air Command Headquarters in Nebraska, and to the White House Situation Room. The entire system, from detection to decision, was designed to function in under 15 minutes, the flight time of a Soviet missile over the pole. It was a technological marvel, a testament to American ingenuity. And in the fall of 1979, it was about to break down in the most terrifying way imaginable. The first crack in this technological shield appeared shortly before 9 a.m. on the morning of November 9, 1979. Inside the fluorescent-lit battle staff room of the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, the morning shift was underway. Air Force officers, steeped in the arcane language of nuclear command and control, monitored their consoles with a practiced, almost bored diligence. Most days were an exercise in routine, watching for the occasional stray satellite or meteor re-entry. This day would be different. Suddenly, without warning, the screens flickered to life with a pattern every officer present had been trained to recognize, but prayed they would never see. The main displays, fed by the powerful Honeywell computers, began to show a massive, coordinated Soviet missile launch. It wasn't a single missile or a small probe. The system was reporting a full-scale assault. One account stated as many as 1,400 ICBMs were leaving their silos on trajectories for the United States. A full-scale decapitation strike was, according to the machine, underway. Instantly, the carefully rehearsed protocols of nuclear Armageddon kicked into motion. A threat assessment conference call was established, linking the NORAD command post with the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon and the underground headquarters of Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska. But even as the alert klaxon sounded, a crucial element of human skepticism began to assert itself. The attack profile on the screen was chaotic, illogical. It didn't fit any of the expected Soviet war plans. Crucially, the raw data feeds from the sensor network showed nothing. The BMEWS radar sites in Greenland and Alaska reported clear skies. The DSP satellites saw no telltale infrared blooms over the Siberian missile fields. The machine was screaming that the world was ending, but the actual sensors, the eyes and ears of the system, were reporting total silence. This critical disconnect between the processed display and the raw data convinced the commanders on duty that they were looking at a system malfunction, not an actual attack. Still, the procedure had to be followed. As a precaution, 10 interceptor jets were scrambled from bases in the northern United States and Canada to protect against a potential bomber attack. The National Emergency Airborne Command Post, or NEACP, the President's Flying Command Center, was launched from Andrews Air Force Base. But the most critical step was not taken. No alert was sent to Strategic Air Command's Bomber Force, and no order was given to Minuteman missile crews to begin their launch procedures. The nuclear forces remained at their normal state of readiness. The entire crisis lasted for 6 agonizing minutes. Frantic troubleshooting by on-site technicians revealed the source of the error. A technician, running a drill, had accidentally loaded a training tape containing a highly realistic wargame scenario into the wrong computer system. The tape, designed to test the system's ability to handle a full-scale attack, had fed its simulated data into the live operational network. The ghost in the machine was, in this case, a simple human mistake. The alert was canceled, the fighters returned to base. The incident was quickly classified, and a Government Accountability Office investigation was launched. The report, when it came out, was damning, revealing a shocking lack of safeguards to prevent test data from contaminating the live warning system. The Soviets, who detected the sudden activity, lodged a formal protest. Leonid Brezhnev himself sent a message to President Carter, warning that such errors were fraught with tremendous danger. Washington sent back reassurances that the issue had been identified and fixed, but it hadn't been. The November 1979 incident was chalked up to human error and a faulty procedure. The system's hardware was still considered fundamentally sound. That assumption was about to be proven catastrophically false. The training tape incident had been a dress rehearsal. The early hours of June 3, 1980, Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, was asleep in his Washington, D.C. home when the phone on his nightstand rang. It was the call every Cold War official dreaded. The duty officer at the National Military Command Center was on the line, his voice devoid of emotion, delivering the most terrifying news imaginable. NORAD was reporting a Soviet missile attack. The initial display was small, just 2 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, but in the grammar of nuclear war, this was the expected opening move. Brzezinski knew the protocol. The first launch of SLBMs was the classic start to a Soviet surprise attack designed to cripple Washington, D.C., SAC headquarters, and other key command centers before the main ICBM force arrived. He asked for confirmation. As he waited, he made a cold, personal calculation. His wife was sleeping next to him. He knew that in a full-scale nuclear exchange, Washington would be vaporized within minutes. There would be no time to escape. He decided not to wake her. It was better, he reasoned, for her to die in her sleep. Moments later, the phone rang again. It was the duty officer with an update. The situation had escalated with breathtaking speed. The display at Strategic Air Command had jumped to 200 SLBMs. At the National Military Command Center, the screens were now showing an unbelievable 2,200 Soviet ICBMs inbound. This was not a limited strike. This was the full, horrifying salvo. This was Armageddon. The officer informed Brzezinski that he had only minutes to confirm the attack with the president, who would then have to decide whether to authorize a full-scale American retaliation. The fate of human civilization rested on this single, 3-minute conversation. Across the United States, the nuclear war machine surged to life. At Strategic Air Command, bomber crews sprinted across the tarmac to their B-52s, starting the engines and preparing for immediate takeoff. In the underground launch capsules dotting the Great Plains, Minuteman missile crews went to a higher alert posture, opened their safes, and prepared for the final coded order from the President. The Pacific Command's airborne command post, codenamed Blue Eagle, took to the skies and would remain airborne for hours. The NEACP, the President's flying bunker, began taxiing for takeoff. The entire multi-trillion-dollar apparatus of American nuclear power was poised on a hair trigger. But once again, inside the granite heart of Cheyenne Mountain, the human element provided the last, desperate firewall against catastrophe. Just like in the November incident, the senior officers on duty looked at the terrifying displays and then demanded to see the raw data from the sensor networks. And once again, the sensors reported absolute silence. The BMEWS radars saw nothing. The DSP satellites detected no heat blooms. There were no missiles. The attack was a phantom. After 3 terrifying minutes, which to Brzezinski must have felt like an eternity, the alert was canceled. The bomber crews shut down their engines. The missileers stood down from their heightened alert. The world had, once again, stepped back from the brink. An immediate high-priority investigation was launched. The November training tape incident was one thing, but this was a failure of the live system itself. The problem was compounded by the fact that this wasn't an isolated event. A minor 6-second glitch had occurred just a week earlier, on May 28th. Then, before investigators could isolate the new problem, it happened again. On June 6th, Another volley of phantom Soviet missiles appeared on NORAD's screens. Once more, SAC bomber crews started their engines. This time, the reaction was faster. Having just been through the ordeal, the commanders immediately checked the raw sensor data and confirmed it was another false alarm. But the psychological damage was done. The most sophisticated defense system in human history was now utterly untrustworthy. It was crying wolf, and no one knew why. The Kremlin, which had once again seen the sudden spike in American military activity, was now profoundly spooked. Was this a technical failure or a deliberate American provocation? Teams of engineers and programmers descended upon Cheyenne Mountain. They ran every diagnostic imaginable, poring over the system's architecture, and finally, they found it. The source of two of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War wasn't a master Soviet plot or a complex software bug. It was a single, failed integrated circuit in a communications multiplexer, a device that processed information from the sensor sites before it was fed to the main display computers. A faulty chip, a component worth 46 cents, had begun to randomly spit out strings of the digit 2 into the data stream. The system, interpreting this garbage data as a launch report, dutifully displayed a missile attack on the screens. The number of missiles, 200 and 2,200, was a complete digital illusion created by a piece of faulty hardware no bigger than a fingernail. The diagnosis was as simple as it was terrifying. A 46-cent component had failed. But for the leadership in the Kremlin, this explanation was not available. All Soviet signals intelligence and human assets could report was what they observed. That in the space of 7 months, the American nuclear apparatus had spun up to a state of maximum alert on at least 3 separate occasions for no discernible reason. B-52s had started their engines, elite command posts had taken to the sky, and then, just as suddenly, everything had returned to normal. From the paranoid vantage point of the GRU's headquarters in Moscow, there were only 2 plausible explanations, and both were precursors to Armageddon. The first, and perhaps most terrifying, was that the American command and control system was dangerously unstable. The image of the United States as a technologically superior, ruthlessly efficient adversary by one of a twitchy, unreliable nuclear power whose own machines could accidentally trigger the apocalypse. The logic was inescapable. If the Americans could not control their own warning systems, how could they be trusted to control their missiles? The second possibility was even more sinister. What if the failures weren't failures at all? What if the Americans were deliberately triggering their own alerts? Perhaps it was a form of psychological warfare, designed to fray Soviet nerves and keep them off balance. Or, in the most dangerous interpretation, what if these alerts were a form of practice, a drill to mask the preparations for a genuine, disarming first strike? The Soviets had a deep, abiding fear of a bolt-from-the-blue attack designed to decapitate their leadership. These inexplicable American alerts looked exactly like the kind of electronic feint that might precede such an attack. This crisis exposed a fundamental philosophical divide in how the two superpowers approached the atomic trigger. The American system, for all its flaws, was built with human skepticism engineered into its very core. The protocols demanded that NORAD commanders cross-check the computer's conclusions against raw sensor data from separate sources, a concept known as dual phenomenology. It was this built-in requirement for human confirmation that saved the world in 1979 and 1980. The machine could shout, but a human had to verify before the signal was passed to the president as confirmed reality. The Soviet system, while also reliant on human verification, was more centralized and heavily oriented towards a launch-on-warning doctrine. Their own computerized warning network, codenamed OCO, or I, was designed to provide the fastest possible confirmation of an attack. Given the shorter flight times of U.S. missiles from Europe and the North Pole, their general staff operated under immense pressure to retaliate in minutes, lest their own forces be destroyed in their silos. Had a similar chip failed in a Soviet computer, it is an open question whether their system, under its unique doctrinal pressures, would have caught the error in time. The American system had failed, but its philosophy of redundant checks and human oversight had held. The Soviets could never be sure if their own system would do the same. The Pentagon's reaction was a mixture of profound relief and deep institutional embarrassment. The incidents triggered a full-scale Senate Armed Services Committee investigation, co-chaired by Senators Gary Hart and Barry Goldwater. Their final report was a scathing indictment, identifying serious vulnerabilities in the nation's command, control, communications, and intelligence, or C3I network. They concluded that the system for warning of a nuclear attack had profound deficiencies that demanded immediate correction. Sweeping changes were mandated, the faulty chip was replaced, but the solution went far deeper. A brand new dedicated off-site testing facility was constructed at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. Its sole purpose was to serve as a perfect software and hardware replica of the live NORAD system, allowing technicians to run war games and diagnostics without any possibility of the test data ever contaminating the operational network again. New software was written with more sophisticated error-checking routines, designed to immediately flag and reject the kind of nonsensical data stream that the failed chip had produced. The entire philosophy was shifted from simply trusting the output to constantly verifying the integrity of the data at every step of the process. In essence, the Pentagon was forced to reckon with the fact that its greatest technological achievement had become one of its greatest vulnerabilities. And so, the great nuclear standoff entered a new, more terrifying phase. For the men in the Kremlin, the incidents of 1979 and 1980 were a chilling revelation. Much of their strategic posture assumed a rational American adversary. They could understand a first strike motivated by ideology or a desperate geopolitical gamble. What they could not comprehend was a first strike triggered by a stray line of code or a burnt-out transistor. The enemy they had prepared for was a cunning chess master. The enemy they now faced was a blind, chaotic force, the specter of technological failure. This fear was no secret. In the aftermath of the false alarms, Soviet anxiety sharpened. Within 2 years, the KGB, under the direct order of Yuri Andropov, launched Operation Ryan, a sweeping, high-priority intelligence effort to detect any and all indicators of a Western first strike. The priority for their intelligence services broadened from stealing secrets to desperately trying to understand U.S. decision-making and its warning posture. They weren't just afraid of an intentional attack anymore. They were now terrified of an accidental one. The final concession to this new reality wasn't a public statement or a line in a treaty, but a quiet, chilling consensus that formed within the intelligence communities of both nations. Both systems relied on humans as the last gate against the abyss. On the U.S. side, commanders in Cheyenne Mountain saved the world in 1979 and 1980. And on the Soviet side, just a few years later in 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov would defy his own system's automated warnings, judging an OCO satellite alert of an incoming American strike to be false, and in doing so, preventing a retaliatory launch. And here we find the ultimate lesson of the 46-cent chip. For 40 years, the world fixated on the ideological struggle between East and West. We imagined that if the end came, it would be because of a decision made in Moscow or Washington, a deliberate act of aggression born from hatred or fear. But the story of the NORAD false alarms reveals one of the closest brushes the world has ever had with a non-malicious technical failure leading to catastrophe. It wasn't malice, but a malfunction that nearly ended civilization. The vast, complex systems the superpowers built to keep the peace had become so intricate that their control could fail in utterly unexpected ways. In the final terrifying analysis, the Soviet Union and the United States had prepared for every scenario except the most dangerous one of all, the day the machine would simply be wrong.